So we're on the left, we're finding it very difficult to even talk about differences between men and women, right? That there's, start with a uterus and then, count from there, right? That is already a taboo conversation to have. And that, as we said at the beginning in talking about Twitter, that one writer, again, I think her name is Megan Murphy, she got booted for saying men are not women.
Yeah.
Right? That's so politically, I'm very worried that unless we resolve that or just cut through it, we don't stand a chance against Trump in 2020.
Ah yes, the you don't allow us to treat you like shit, therefore we are going to vote for terrible people argument. Or as I like to call it, rights at ransom. Because that's what's actually being forwarded here, even though that's not the way it's being framed. Take the claim that Megan Murphy got suspended from Twitter for simply stating that men are not women. The reality is Megan Murphy was booted from Twitter, first temporarily and then permanently, for an unrelenting campaign against trans people. And whilst yes, that tweet was part of the reason, it was not a comment given some vacuum free of a much larger context as you present it. This is like watching a white person make monkey noises at black sports players whilst waving a banana, before then going on to claim that they were thrown out for simply monkeying around. When said actions are carried out, they're done so with a specific intent in mind, namely to dehumanize not only the individual, but an entire demographic. Nobody was upset with the statement that men are not women. Trans people agree with said statement. They were upset with the subtext, the assertion that a specific segment of women aren't really women, but are in fact men. There's a big difference between saying that men are not women and saying that men are not women, and by men I mean women I've been constantly abusing for the past 3 years. Whilst the hostility towards trans people goes back further than this, she actively campaigned alongside Jordan Peterson in lying about the protections offered to transgender people under the Canadian C-16 bill in 2016. She was trying to actively block protections for the people she then continued to berate for the next 2 years, until Twitter finally had no choice but to get off their backsides and impose the terms of service we all agreed to when we signed up. There's also no taboo surrounding the discussion of womanhood. There's simply an expectation of civility. If your idea of that consists of thumping a 3rd grade science textbook, proclaiming that women's are wombs, that's just science and you can't change my mind, that's not a respectable basis for an actual discussion. That's actually how the Christian right is stripping away not only trans protections, but abortion access, by reducing the definition of a woman down to nothing but that of a birthing vat, as has already happened in Utah. And people like Megan Murphy pave the way in gold for said bills. She offers them a token of legitimacy for their feigned concerns surrounding women. But back in reality, I'm rather curious. If your wife developed cancer and required a hysterectomy, would the removal of her uterus in any way alter her gender? If not, then maybe the answer to the question as to what makes a woman goes a little beyond their ability to pump out babies. So yes, today we'll be taking on not only Joe Rogan, but Sam Harris. The segment comes from a much longer podcast on the Joe Rogan Experience, referenced in the description as always. The lead up to this conversation was what had occurred at Google surrounding James Damore and his memo attacking Google's equality measures. As a reminder, Damore made out that the disparity between men and women in tech companies was not the result of millennia of observable discrimination, but biological differences that somehow made women less capable at said tech jobs. He also went on to argue that measures introduced to tackle said observable issues were effectively reverse sexism, and yet Harris plays down said diatribe as simply a B-grade paper on human biology. Because, who doesn't want to work in a place where your peers constantly belittle you and what you've achieved? It's like the phrase hostile work environment doesn't exist in Harris's little world. The impact of the memo is well documented. Many women were made to feel unsupported in their work environment and began interviewing elsewhere. Like the Megan Murphy thing, this shit does not exist in some sort of vacuum. And yeah, I can already see the comments about how said people clearly couldn't hack it. But the reality is, we don't go to work to be abused or made to feel unwelcome. We go to work to get a job done, get paid, and live our life. Now this discussion comes as part of a long string of stories about the so-called SJW menace, in which both Harris and Rogan actively misportray some issues and lump others that really do not belong together in attempts to paint the responses as unreasonable, as we have just seen. And it's about to get a whole lot worse as Joe goes on a transphobic tirade to Harris's amusement. It's pretty rough to watch.
I was reading a story about a woman who's on some sort of an LBGT panel, and she's a part of some group, and she was kicked out of it by a man who identifies as a lesbian, and he has a penis.
Right. Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
where do we go there?
Yeah. Exactly. But ironically, and this is a point that
I think he has a penis.
Yeah.
I want to be sure. He definitely identifies as a lesbian. I might have read a Twitter comment about how preposterous that was and said the penis part.
The woman being aggressively misgendered here is feminist activist Ava Pipperton. Now, I'm not even going to entertain conversation as to the state of Miss Pipperton's genitals. Her junk is not my business. Or your business for that matter. You're just a fucking creep with a microphone. And as for Harris, who's just sitting there, chuckling along to all of this, fuck you, I expected better. Like, I realise a large portion of the secular community adores you. Now, I never have. But honestly, go fuck yourself. Both for failing to call Rogan out on his crap, as well as what you're about to go on to say in a second. But bringing this back to reality, the bigot in question, Julia Beck, was removed from her position on a Baltimore LGBTQ commission panel. She was then later replaced by a lesbian feminist, the aforementioned Ava Pipperton. Now, note the presence of the T in the name of that panel. This was not added after Julia Beck ran for the position. She chose to become part of that panel and then enact hostility towards trans people. Namely, she recycled conservative Christian arguments that had previously been used to argue that gay people were a danger to society, particularly children. As with the Christian usage, she used this argument to forward denying the civil and human rights of transgender people. And this, of course, got her a spot on Faux News with Tucker Carlson.
Julia Beck joins us now on set. Julia, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So you said something that I think many people would in their hearts think is obvious, but very few people are willing to say out loud. You said it knowing you would likely be punished for saying it, but you said it anyway. Why did you do that?
I believe in the truth. I believe that people should have these conversations and say things that matter without fear of punishment.
You are old-fashioned. Why do you think, I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm grateful that you have that attitude, but why do you think it was important to say this specifically?
Well, when we get down to it, women and girls all share a biological reality. We are all female. But if any male person can call himself a woman or legally identify as female, then predatory men will do so in order to gain access to women's single-sex spaces, and this puts every woman and girl at risk.
That's from the beginning. I don't weigh in on this often because sexual politics is a morass, and it's not worth it, to be totally honest with you. But I have enough daughters that I care, and my instinct has always been this change in our society, which we never debated, the terms have never been clarified, is not going to be good for girls in the long run. Do you share that concern?
I definitely do agree. Like I said, this puts every woman and girl at risk of male violence, and this is already happening in many states. In many states, men can legally identify themselves as female and gain access to women's single-sex spaces. And sports is just one institution where men are taking titles, scholarships, and this is a problem.
Except no, it's really not. Though it's good of you to acknowledge the fact that said trans-inclusive policies are in effect in many places. Though I must add it's not just certain states in the US, but sometimes entire countries for years. For example, Ireland has had gender self-declaration for the past 3 years, and to this day, we haven't seen the sort of thing you are forwarding as a genuine problem. And it's not the only one. Malta, Norway, Portugal, Argentina, and Belgium are all countries with self-identification. Argentina has had this law since 2012. That's 6, going on 7 years that do not show what you claim. Where are all these statistics which support what you assert? Well, they don't exist. All we do have are 1 or 2 high-profile cases being linked to trans people compared to the countless thousands of cis people, both men and women, doing the same. One such case is being shown on screen. That's the case Beck kept utilising until she was suspended. The case of Karen White, who assaulted 2 women in prison. Now, I've used their chosen names since there are conflicting reports on the matter, and I don't know if they're trans or not. But just as I wouldn't respond to an incident involving a rapist of colour with racial slurs, I'm not going to assert that they're not trans simply because they're a rapist. They may very well be a cis man who lied, or they may be a trans woman who is a rapist. But here's the important thing. They had an existing criminal record involving rape and sexual assault. The problem with what happened was not that a person forwarding themselves as a woman was given access to contain people, but that their history was not taken into consideration when moving them about. Full disclosure, both myself and my brother were raped inside a domestic violence refuge by a cis woman. That does not then mean we should block cis women from domestic violence refuges, just in the same way that we don't punish trans people for what one other trans person has done. Certainly, if they're not actually trans, but a cis man pretending to be trans, as you forward. We don't punish one demographic on the basis of violence carried out by another, at least not in a civilized society. Now, I want to talk about the prisons, namely the fact that, as I noted with the refuge, cis women can be predators as well. In fact, back in 2002, whilst female prisons only accounted for around 6% of the prison population in the UK, where this case took place, they accounted for 12% of all sexual assaults in prison. Now, since then, it's decreased to around the same rate as sexual assaults in male prisons. But to point to the one or two instances that have occurred, whether they be of cis men pretending to be trans or of trans women who are simply rapists, to then argue that the millions of trans people in the US forego their civil and human rights as a result, is barbaric. White has faced trial and is now doing time for her crimes. And they should do so in the way that other sexual offenders, whether they be cis man or cis woman, are dealt with. But their being a trans woman wouldn't justify stripping the rest of trans people of their rights, and their being a cis man wouldn't justify stripping trans people of their rights either. However you frame this, it doesn't work. It's a red herring. And beyond that, you've got nothing. There's a couple of high-profile cases because said cases sold newspapers as part of the trans panic. Now I can point to numerous lesbian predators, but unlike you, I'm not so low to argue that this justifies stripping you of your rights. Quick question. If a rapist doesn't care enough to respect your bodily autonomy, what makes you think they'll respect a piece of blue plastic stuck on a bathroom door? Sexual harassment of any kind is still illegal, no matter the gender of the culprit. So it seems that your grasp of the so-called facts seems a little loose.
So it seems like a real problem. Why wouldn't women's groups who exist to carry the banner for women raise the alarm about this?
Women have been speaking out about this for decades, but we have been effectively silenced. Many women, like myself, have been pushed out of spaces that we built, spaces that are intended to include us, simply because we acknowledge biological reality.
Do you think, you're lesbian, you are in the same acronym as a bunch of other groups, including people who are transgendered. Do you think that makes it more difficult for you to make this argument? I mean, it seems like this has been so politicized that you're expected to have a certain set of views that maybe you don't have.
I see where you're coming from. I would like to make a distinction here. The letters in the acronym share not much. The L, G, and B are based on sexualities. They're based on sex, biological realities.
Yes.
But the T is based on gender identity, which is not based in biological reality. In fact, I would argue that it's opposed to biological reality. The LGB is very different from the T, and I don't think it's fair to lump us all into the same acronym.
Do you find it astounding that it is considered an act of bravery to defend biology?
I wouldn't say so myself, but I guess that's where we are right now, and I hope more women stand up.
Last question, because I can't remember. What did they say to you? You were thrown off this commission. You were punished for saying this out loud. What was the rationale for it?
Frankly, there was no case made. My accuser said that they didn't have to make a case. One of the members of my committee argued that sex was a thing of the past. He said, frankly, science had progressed so far that sex was unimportant. I argued the opposite.
Julia Beck, at a time like this, everyone thinks, so I would say what I really think, but most people are afraid to, and you're not. And I'm definitely standing in admiration of that. Thank you for that.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's total bullshit, and here's why. The science is relevant, and that science shows that Beck, Carlson, Rogan, and as we're about to see in a second, Harris, they're all talking out their asses. Back in December, I did a story about the Friendly Atheist appearance on Faux News to talk about shifting patterns of belief. Whilst on said show, the Friendly Atheist had a conversation about the Trump administration's move to construct a legal definition of sex that excluded, amongst several things, transgender people sprung upon them. Now that debate revolved around a specific tweet put out by Nature magazine with an accompanying article. The tweet stated, quote, "The US Department of Health and Human Services proposes to establish a legal definition of whether someone is male or female based on the genitals they were born with. This proposal has no foundation in science and should be abandoned." End quote. And from this, a truly horrific soundbite was born.
Not
we learn
on the
more as
subjective
time
new
goes
definition of
on.
gender. Well, then
if
let
this
Congress
administration
change
cares
it.
about science, they should talk to the people who study this stuff for a living.
Well,
they should look
then
at
that's fine. If
organizations
that's
that know this
true,
information.
If
Well,
that's
Nature
true,
magazine-
then the facts would be on the side of Nature magazine.
Yeah,
If
Nature
the facts
magazine is
were
a
on the side
magazine.
here,
It's not the people who do this for a
I
living.
don't need an education on science from someone who is known for rejecting it all the time.
That shit right there still grates the fuck out of me to this day. The problem for Faux News is the fact that Nature magazine is not just a magazine. It is the official magazine of Nature Journal. It's one of, if not the largest peer-reviewed scientific journal out there. It receives international praise for its high scientific standard, and it has no problem acknowledging the science when everyone else in this video thus far has refused to do so. Friendly Atheist excluded. As the Friendly Atheist noted, our understanding of sex and gender has evolved, as science does with the availability of new information, and the dogmatic refusal to update one's understanding, to stick with geocentrism in spite of the evidence, that's not science. That's the very opposite of science. It's a fucking embarrassment, is what it is. You have no claim to science, so stop pretending like you do. You're just a bigot looking for an excuse. Gender critical is to trans people what race realism is to people of colour. Fun fact, the brain is physical. Entirely physical. There's no immaterial spiritual part to it. Unless Harris wants to argue there is, in which case, I think he's going to have a big problem with a lot of his fans. Therefore, it has as much a part to play in sexual distinction as other physical sexual characteristics, both those we can control and those we can't. Yet, to exclude the mind from the equation of genitals, hormones, chromosomes, gametes, and internal structures is to look at things with only a partial picture, and not all of these things will impact social interaction to the same degree. As ContraPoints noted in her wonderful Are Traps Gay video, something you should definitely check out if you haven't already, we're not born with sensors to detect chromosomes. I'm sorry, that's just basic biology. The brain, meanwhile, which allows for said social interactions, has a massive part to play. That's why I don't see a sharp sex and gender distinction. I see gender as an attribute of sex, nestled in its total form. You can't discuss sex properly without first acknowledging gender and its real measurable impact, just like love relates to sexuality. Refuse to support a trans person and 1 in 2 will attempt suicide. Support them and their levels of depression and anxiety drop down to rates equivalent to a cisgender control. Cisgender, by the way, simply means someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. The opposite to transgender, if you will. Forcing a person to deny their gender, just like forcing a person to deny their sexuality, that causes psychopathology. That's a fact you cannot dispute whether or not my understanding of sex and gender is accurate. Since contrary to what Harris and Rogan claim, this is not a taboo subject, so long as the conversation is carried out in good faith. That's why there are many different views on the subject. They're out there if you're genuinely curious to study them. If you're just looking to spite transgender people, however, is it any wonder that we refuse to engage with you on said terms? Now, I need to be clear here in that Beck belongs to a very vocal minority. Last summer, a group of her peers forced their way to the front of London Pride and distributed anti-trans materials, claiming things such as trans men were really cis lesbians who had been converted. That's right, a small group of cis lesbians talk about trans men as some sort of lost sexual experience in the same way that cis heterosexual men talk about lesbians as women being denied to them. Something which becomes even more fucked up when we acknowledge the fact that the focus is very often on young trans folk. But it is a small minority, and in response to this, many pride marchers such as Brighton and Manchester had L for T, that's lesbian for trans people, lead their parades to allow cis lesbians a way to show their solidarity for trans folk. And why wouldn't they? Anti-trans narratives like the one Beck forwards will only be used to hurt all women. I've already mentioned the Utah case in which these arguments were used to define woman as nothing but a birthing vat, something which is used to attack abortion access, but I'd just like to show you another real way this hurts cis women. Warning, the following video contains police harassment.
This is a girl, and you guys are harassing her because she's a dyke.
And I'm a fucking female.
This is a girl.
Do I have to tell you again?
You have ID?
No, I do not.
Get out. Then out. Then out. You got no ID, get out.
This is so sad.
Out.
Oh, and she's a girl and you're yelling in her face. That's crazy. Don't worry, I got you. I got
Put hands on
you.
me again, bro.
Wow, look what you... Oh, okay.
Get out, sir. Get out.
Man.
That is a fucking girl.
I'm fucking
That is a girl.
Let's go. Let's go. You have no ID, let's go. Time to go, sir.
So you're saying you had to have an ID to go to the bathroom?
Get out of my
Hey,
go.
you can all leave if you
We're
want
all
to.
leaving. We are all leaving. Like I said, this is a girl. Don't put your hands on a girl.
Let's go. Come on. No ID,
That's
let's go.
fucking... I don't come at you, my God.
That woman is a cis woman. Cis or cisgender meaning that they identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, like Beck herself. Apparently, she wasn't just a cis woman, however, but a cis lesbian who, as you just saw, was forcibly removed from the women's bathroom for failing to adhere to puritanical standards of femininity. Now, said video resurfaced surrounding the North Carolina and Mississippi bills on transgender bathroom access, so it's not a direct result of said bills, but it is a sign of the greater culture, and this is not the only occurrence. I can go on to note several cases of cis women being harassed because they don't fit into the patriarchal norms of gender presentation, and look more like what some ignorant cis people believe a trans woman looks like. Meanwhile, there are countless trans women who can and do pass under the radar. So not only would it be practically impossible to stop trans women entering said spaces, but you'd hurt cis women in attempts to do so. And I haven't even discussed the addition of intersex people to the equation, which just, again, blows things up in a whole nother vector. Now, that should not be the only reason for you to do the right thing. Believe me, it doesn't please me to have to make a conversation about trans rights focus on cis women's safety. But I realise that you've already made it clear that you hate trans people anyway, so to appeal to your empathy there, that'd be a total waste of my time. This also answers why women's groups don't support Beck. Not only are her actions abusive towards certain groups of women and therefore should rightfully be rejected, but they harm women as a whole, which is why people such as Beck have to turn to the religious right to get the majority of their support. Far-right Christian groups are putting money directly into the hands of people like Beck and her small group of feminism appropriators to act as their handmaidens, to be the token shield as they not only gut the LGBT+ community, but destroy abortion access for all. Feminism appropriator Jean Hatchett, a very vocal member of the We Need to Talk group that has been touring the UK in opposition to gender recognition changes, publicly left the group in January. Why? Well, even she found herself unable to tolerate groups such as the Women's Liberation Front, aka WOLF, any longer. Turns out that said group is a front for a conservative Christian ideology. WOLF is backed and funded by organisations including the Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation, the Family Policy Alliance, and independent media, receiving donations as large as $15,000 at any single time, and that's just the stuff we know of. If you don't know who independent media are, they are the group who sued the University of Washington's Birth Defects Research Center in hopes of obtaining employees' names and home addresses to then release them to the public, in hopes that this would result in violence against said researchers. The reason being said center utilizes fetal tissue in its research. These groups are not only fundamentally anti-LGBT+, but anti-abortion access as well. And all of this is part of a larger show. Venice Allen, aka Dr. Radfem, no actual degree, a 44-year-old stalker of teenage girls, praised Conservative MP David Davies. She thanked him for, quote, standing up for lesbians, end quote. Rather ironic considering he'd historically voted against marriage equality at every vote he attended. She also routinely misgenders cis women for not appearing feminine enough if they support trans people. Similarly, Posey Parker pandered to Stephen Yaxley Lennon, aka Tommy Robinson, celebrating his jeopardization of a court case surrounding child victims of sexual assault to line his own pockets. The connections from these people leading directly to the far right, even open Nazis who blame feminism for refugees, never ends. Posey Parker got in a lot of shit recently for offering lip service to literal Holocaust deniers. There is nothing feminist about these appropriators at all. They're just a new front for religion, one which Sam Harris and Joe Rogan are both actively promoting, even if unwittingly. I should note, however, the trans community has been actively aware of this for years, but of course, we're never listened to in this conversation. As a result, Harris has gone from being a champion of secularism in the eyes of many to being a slave of religion, doing their work for them. Well done. Harris presents this, you don't allow us to treat you like shit, therefore we're going to vote for terrible people argument. But here's the thing, if you have to lie about what's actually going on, then most likely it's those lies and not the challenging a certain issue that turns people away. You are playing right into the hands of the far right by parroting this ignorant crap. You are in effect a far right enabler. Take some damn responsibility for your actions. Yet of course, shits like Harris want to paint all of this as the trans people's fault, as if we're the ones funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to strip away the rights of others. However, I do hope that we can see the way in which Rogan and Harris try to present this topic has little attachment to the true complexity of the matter. But let's continue to see what else Harris has to say for himself.
Well, this is something that Andrew Sullivan wrote in a recent article on this, is that the transgender thing is at odds with gay rights in a fundamental sense. I mean, you can't balance these equations because gay identity absolutely focuses on the legitimate differences between men and women. It's like, I'm a man, I like men, I don't like women, that's my situation. But once you change your notion of what, how gender relates to sex, it begins to erode this claim on the legitimacy of gay identity. Right?
Well, the thing is that they're all marginalized, so they stick together. That's the idea, I guess, behind it. Because,
sort of, but I can only imagine what Andrew Sullivan's Twitter feed looks like now, because when he writes these articles, I'm sure he just gets eviscerated by the left. And he's just straight up talking about this is what gay rights looks like, and this is how you can't be a man with a penis who's identifies as a lesbian, right?
But you can't say that.
Right.
And you also can't say that a man with a penis is not a woman. Because if a man with a penis...
I can say it because I can't be fired.
But if you do say it, you will get a certain amount of hate. I mean, there's people that are saying that men who will not date trans women who still have penises, they're transphobic.
Yeah, transphobic.
And this is... I mean, have you ever met Jamie Kilstein?
You say it's not possible, and yet here we are, having coexisted since the late Paleolithic. That's over 10,000 years, actively proving you wrong. The statement that sexuality and gender are incompatible is as founded as the assertion that atheists cannot have higher philosophical concepts without God. And just like that, I have this to say to you. If your model about what we should see doesn't match the evidence, you revise the model, you don't deny the evidence. You're no better than Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron at this point. Has it possibly occurred to you that your cishet understanding of what it means to be gay, bisexual or trans is somewhat limited? Of course not. It's reality that must be wrong if you don't see what you want to see. I think you should have heeded Nietzsche's advice on fighting monsters, since you seem to have picked up a few religious artifacts over your career. So that's the end of the video, since it veers off to discuss other subjects, not directly related to what we're discussing here. But I still have a lot to say about what's being forwarded in the last minute and a half, starting with the claim that sexuality is based on some sort of biological truth from which trans people are excluded. How does one reach that conclusion? This is a claim that shatters upon demonstrating the existence of a single person attracted to trans men and women as they are cis men and women. That's to say, many people who are attracted to cis men, be they heterosexual or bisexual women, or bisexual or gay men, are also attracted to trans men. Meanwhile, many people who are attracted to cis women, be they heterosexual or bisexual men, or bisexual or heterosexual women, are also attracted to trans women. There are certainly far more heterosexual men attracted to trans women than homosexual men, a revelation that completely renders your claims void. As for some overlap, sexuality is messy. Contrary to popular belief, terms such as gay, straight and bisexual are not fast and secure terms. Sure, there are people who are not attracted to trans people, That doesn't delegitimize their gender any more than the existence of people who are not attracted to, say, people of colour delegitimizes their being human. But it is something we can discuss the root cause of. That's to say, question as to whether some cis men say they're not attracted to non-op or pre-op trans women because of the penis, or whether it's because of society's stigma centered around toxic notions of masculinity. And one only has to look at the spike in trans-related porn in places where anti-trans bills are passed to shed a little more light on the question. Now, I need to be clear. This is not me claiming that you have to go out there and have sex with trans people if you don't want to. That would be rape. We all have some inherent preferences, but your overall preferences are not free of scrutiny. The way society discusses ideas such as manhood and womanhood, as well as the way it constructs beauty, is going to play a part in your choice, and we have every right to discuss whether said impact is fair. One attentive scroll through a dating app and you'll soon become aware of the racism inherent with a lot of dating scenes, both LGBT+ and non. Statements such as no blacks and no Asians are sadly rampant. Now, is this the result of innate dating preferences? Possibly to a degree, but there's no chance that the societal standards of beauty and gender don't play a role in the vast majority of cases. This is evidenced in the stereotypes often thrown out as a justification. Statements such as, I don't date black women because they're too independent and that makes me feel insecure about my masculinity, lack basis in reality, but they still influence dating habits. And if you hold such a view, isn't that racist? Therefore, if someone were to hold a similar prejudice about trans people, couldn't we begin to see how that might link to transphobia? I also find it funny how you cry about not being able to openly talk about things, but you try to bury complex discussions such as these. I mean, Joe Rogan demonstrates that pretty well right here. Rather than talking about trans women and their range of physical attributes, he boils them all down to a singular trait, that of a penis. The question then emerges, how does he feel about post-op trans women? I also have a hypothetical scenario I'd like to forward. It's one based heavily on another hypothetical designed to get a person to reflect on their own body to gender relation. Many of you have likely heard the question being asked, what if you as a person were in an accident and as a result lost either your penis or your vulva? Now, don't ask me how an accident could replace a vulva with a penis, but just humour the hypothetical, will you? Would that affect your gender? To which most people would say, no. Now, I'd like to build on this one by asking the next logical question, specifically aiming this one at Harris. If you were to have such an accident in which you lost your penis, would you still hope that your wife remained attracted to you? And if she was, would that change her sexuality in any way? Thing is, this strict biological view on sexuality is fucked from the start. Again, I bring forward the existence of intersex individuals. Where do they begin to fit into this strict binary? They don't. And rather than lecturing the LGBT+ community about what they can and cannot do, reducing all sexuality to nothing more than a sexual act, which is exactly what the religious people do all the time, perhaps you could sit down for a minute and learn a lesson from us. The label bisexual, to which I am particularly attached to myself, was one founded in a purely binary perspective. Hell, it's sort of in the name, bisexual. But as time moved on and our understanding of gender has grown, so too has the term bisexual. I'm what's known as the same and other bisexual. I'm open to dating non-binary folk, such as myself. Now, what this shows us is very important to the conversation we are having. The LGBT+ community is still growing and exploring itself. As that happens, the terms we use will also shift slightly in their usage. But even then, at any one time, the same term can have slightly different meanings dependent on the person or context, and that's perfectly fine. There's no LGBT+ doctrine, no tablets carved in stone. We're a living community coming together to explore ourselves better, to try on labels with a general shared meaning to better describe ourselves. And your ignorance has no place here, telling us what we can and cannot do. The existence of non-heterosexual trans people kills your argument outright. And that's all I really have left to say. But what do you guys think? Are the T and the LGB incompatible? Are you disappointed at the way in which Harris failed to call out Rogan? Why do cishet men keep trying to tell the LGBT+ community what we can and cannot do? Is Harris responsible for aiding and abetting conservative Christianity? Did I miss anything you noticed. If so, be sure to drop us a comment down below. Also, a quick thank you to Adita for helping me write the dating section. Your insight is truly invaluable to me. I'll link a few of our other videos at the end of this one, so be sure to go give them a watch. Now don't forget that you can support us on Patreon. We are trying to make the channel ad-free, so be sure to check that out. And speaking of Patreon, I'd just like to thank all of the amazing people who have donated to the channel over the years, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, McGay, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, Evan Heimberg, Alexander Williams, and Atlas5. Take care now, and I'll see you next time.